There are moments that shake even the most unshakable institutions. Moments where silence can no longer hold back the tide of truth. If you care about stories that cut through the polished surface and reveal what's really happening behind the gilded walls, then make sure you subscribe right now so you don't miss any of the updates and deep dives we bring you here. This is a story about a single act of courage that broke through layers of secrecy. A story about love, defiance, and the breaking of tradition in the most unexpected way. At the center of it all stands Princess Anne, her voice trembling as she shattered the long-maintained silence surrounding Princess Catherine's health. It was early October when the palace's carefully constructed wall of quiet began to crack, and what followed changed everything. For months, the royal family had maintained a calm, almost rehearsed silence about Catherine's condition. Public statements were brief, polished, and deliberately vague. They used phrases like resting at home and recovering privately, words meant to soothe, words meant to keep the public at arm's length. But behind those carefully chosen lines, the truth was much heavier. A private clinic, a hidden hospitalization, and weeks of quiet suffering were all kept away from the public eye. What made this different was that someone within the family could no longer live with that silence. Princess Anne, known for her loyalty and her fierce sense of duty, became the unexpected voice of honesty. On a cool October morning, just after 9, cameras captured Anne as she stepped forward, visibly shaken, her voice unsteady but determined. Her words were simple, but they struck the world with the force of truth long denied. She called Catherine brave, but unwell. And in those few seconds, the carefully constructed image of calm was shattered. It wasn't just what she said, but how she said it. This wasn't a rehearsed speech or a polished statement approved by a team of advisors. This was one woman standing before the world, deciding that honesty had to outweigh tradition. For decades, the royal family has maintained a tight grip on privacy, especially when it comes to health matters. The idea has always been that the monarchy represents stability, that the image must never crack, no matter what happens behind the scenes. But in this case, the gap between image and reality became too wide to ignore. People had begun to question why Catherine, such a visible and beloved figure, had not been seen for weeks. The palace responded with carefully measured lines, but whispers grew louder with each passing day. When Anne spoke, it was as though she confirmed what many had begun to suspect. Something was not being told. Something was wrong. In the hours that followed, news outlets scrambled to verify. Palace officials rushed to respond, and the public watched in stunned silence. But Anne's words had already traveled far beyond official statements. For the first time, a senior member of the family had stepped outside the invisible barrier of protocol. She had chosen personal loyalty over institutional silence, and in doing so, she forced open a door that others had tried so hard to keep shut. Behind the scenes, the weight of silence had been growing for weeks. Catherine's condition was not a new development. She had been receiving medical care since mid-August, tucked away in a private facility far from the public eye. Only a small circle knew the truth. The public had been told she was resting, but those close to her understood the situation was far more complicated. Official calendars were quietly cleared. Engagements were postponed. Statements were crafted to keep the narrative smooth and unshaken. Yet, even the most carefully built walls have cracks. For Anne, the turning point came after a tense private meeting at Balmoral. It was there, surrounded by the weight of tradition and expectation, that she realized remaining silent was no longer a neutral act. To stay quiet meant to let the world believe a lie. To speak out meant breaking the unwritten rules of royal life. And in that moment, she chose Catherine over custom. She chose truth over image. She chose to speak. Her decision did not come without risk. The institution relies on unity, on presenting a single voice to the world. Speaking out without approval is seen as an act of rebellion. But Anne had something few others did. A bond with Catherine forged not through headlines, but through shared moments, private conversations, and mutual respect. Catherine had once told her that silence isn't always strength. that sometimes strength is found in speaking when no one else will. And those words, as it turned out, would soon echo louder than anyone could have expected. The emotional power of Anne's statement came not just from what it revealed, but from what it represented. For generations, the public has been kept at a distance from the real lives of those inside palace walls. Illnesses have been concealed, marriages curated, emotions hidden beneath ceremonial polish. This time, the truth slipped through because someone decided to let it. The shock that rippled across the nation wasn't just about Catherine's health. It was about the breach of silence. It was about witnessing a moment when the veil lifted, even for a second. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, social media filled with messages of support for Catherine and praise for Anne's courage. People who had felt uneasy about the palace's silence suddenly found their feelings validated. There was a shared sense of being let in, if only briefly, into something real. That sense of raw honesty is rare in such a carefully guarded world, and it struck a chord with millions. For Catherine herself, the silence had become suffocating. She had always understood the expectations that came with her role. The pressure to smile, to stand tall, to keep her struggles private. But she also understood the power of human connection. In private letters, she had confided to those closest to her that secrecy was beginning to feel like a burden rather than protection. One of those letters would later become a crucial piece of this story. But at that early October moment, all the world had was Anne's voice, a breaking of silence that signaled something far deeper than a single statement. As reporters pieced together the timeline, a clearer picture began to emerge. Catherine's health struggles had begun months earlier. They had quietly intensified, even as the official narrative remained unchanged. The palace had chosen to control the message rather than share the truth. But truth has a way of surfacing. It doesn't need permission. It needs only a single spark. And that spark came in the form of Anne standing before cameras and speaking the words no one else would. This moment will likely be remembered not just for what it revealed, but for how it was revealed. It was not through a press conference or a leaked statement from a staffer. It was through family, through someone close enough to care and brave enough to act. And in a world where every royal moment is choreographed and rehearsed, this one felt painfully, powerfully human.
The truth rarely stays buried forever. In the quiet halls where appearances matter more than reality, secrets can be maintained for a time, but eventually they begin to tremble under their own weight. That was the case in the weeks leading up to Anne's statement. A leaked palace memo, quietly circulated among senior aides, would later expose just how carefully the truth had been contained. This document, never meant to see the light of day, revealed that Catherine had in fact been receiving medical treatment at a private clinic since mid-August. It spelled out the schedule of visits, listed the physicians, and detailed the restrictions placed on public appearances. It was meticulous, controlled, and deeply unsettling to anyone who read it, because every line of it contradicted what had been publicly claimed. The official narrative had painted a picture of quiet recovery at home, of privacy, of nothing to worry about. But the reality written in that memo was one of daily check-ins, extended stays, and carefully managed health updates that never reached the outside world. When it leaked, it confirmed what Anne's trembling voice had already hinted at. This wasn't a temporary rest. This wasn't a simple recovery. This was something serious, and the silence surrounding it had not been about protection. It had been about control. The memo showed how layers of approval had been built around every single decision. Only a handful of people had access to the real information. Those who did were required to sign agreements, the kind designed to keep personal matters hidden indefinitely. Meetings were scheduled not just to discuss Catherine's care, but to carefully craft how that care would be framed to the public. Every engagement she missed was accompanied by lines that sounded calm and reassuring, crafted to maintain the illusion of normalcy. And through it all, the palace's official position remained unchanged. Inside that private clinic, far away from the crowds and cameras, Catherine endured those weeks quietly. Her situation was kept so tightly guarded that even some members of the family were not fully aware of the extent of her treatment. A few carefully worded updates reached her inner circle, and only then under the strictest confidence. For the outside world, she had simply disappeared from public view, and the people were expected not to ask too many questions. The palace had underestimated how much her absence would be felt. Catherine had always held a unique place in the public's heart. She was visible, approachable, and carried herself with a warmth that drew people in. Her long silence, her vanishing from events she would usually headline, did not go unnoticed. The official explanations seemed too polished, too perfectly phrased. When the leaked memo confirmed that she had been receiving private medical care for weeks, it was as though an invisible wall cracked open just enough for the world to see what had been hidden behind it. The timing of that leak was no accident. Whispers inside the palace corridors spoke of growing tension. A few insiders had begun to feel the weight of the silence. Some believed the truth would eventually emerge on its own, and it was better to control the timing. Others feared what would happen if it came out at the wrong moment. But in the end, the leak wasn't about strategy. It was about the growing strain of maintaining a story that no longer aligned with reality. When the memo reached journalists, it was initially treated with caution. Unverified leaks can be dangerous, and no one wanted to ignite a storm without certainty. But then came Anne's statement. Her words gave the memo legitimacy it otherwise might not have had. She had spoken of Catherine's bravery and illness, and that was enough to turn what might have been dismissed as rumor into something undeniable. What had once been whispered in corners was now headline news. The palace scrambled to contain the fallout. Official spokespeople issued statements emphasizing Catherine's right to privacy, trying to soften the edges of what had just surfaced. But the memo spoke for itself. It detailed the timeline of her treatment, the frequency of visits, and the decisions made to keep everything quiet. It even contained a chilling phrase repeated throughout the communications plan: silence is stability. It wasn't just about protecting Catherine. It was about protecting the image of the institution. For those on the outside, this phrase became a symbol of everything wrong with the way the situation had been handled. Silence had not brought stability. It had brought confusion, speculation, and ultimately a deeper sense of betrayal. People who had trusted the official narrative now questioned everything. If the palace could conceal something this significant for weeks, what else had been hidden behind those closed doors? The reaction from the public grew more intense with each passing hour. Candlelight vigils began outside royal residences. Messages of support flooded social media, but so did calls for accountability. It wasn't just sympathy for Catherine. It was frustration at having been misled. The public's relationship with this family has always been built on a fragile balance between reverence and scrutiny, and this moment tipped that balance in a way no one could ignore. Inside the palace, the atmosphere grew tense. A quiet panic settled over meetings. Public relations teams worked around the clock to reshape the message. Advisors debated how much to reveal, how much to continue withholding, and whether Anne's words could be walked back or redirected. But once the truth begins to surface, there is no fully pulling it back into the shadows. People had heard her voice. They had seen her face. They believed her. Catherine's situation was now more than a personal struggle. It was a symbol of a larger issue, one that touched on trust, image, and the weight of secrecy. She had spent weeks in a private room, quietly fighting, while the world was told a softer, cleaner version of events. And the knowledge of that reality shook something deep in the public consciousness. The more details emerged, the more clear it became that the palace had not simply been passive in its silence. It had actively built a wall of words around the truth. It had chosen to prioritize appearance over openness. And in doing so, it set the stage for the wave of outrage and heartbreak that would follow. This wasn't just about illness. It was about the cost of hiding it. Anne's statement was the spark, but the leaked memo was the fuel. Together, they created a storm that no carefully crafted press release could contain. And as the public began to realize how long they had been kept in the dark, trust began to fray in a way that would be difficult to mend. What had once been whispers had now become a reckoning. The days that followed the leak were anything but quiet. Within the palace walls, what had once been carefully orchestrated control turned into whispered disagreements, closed-door confrontations, and moments of rare defiance. At the heart of it all stood Princess Anne, who had already made the irreversible decision to speak out. The choice was not one she had made lightly. It came after long, tense conversations, silent car rides, and sleepless nights. Her moment in front of the cameras had not been a slip. It had been a deliberate act, a quiet rebellion against a system that had spent years teaching her to hold her tongue. The breaking point had come during a heated meeting at Balmoral. It was supposed to be just another private gathering, a discussion about messaging and next steps, but what unfolded was far from polite strategy. Senior figures had argued about whether the silence could still be maintained. Words like duty, stability, and protocol filled the air, but none of them addressed the simple truth that Catherine's condition was serious and the public had been misled. And sat in silence at first, listening to the argument circle around the same polished lines. It was in that moment, according to sources who later spoke privately, that something inside her shifted. And had always been fiercely loyal to family. She had spent decades playing her part, keeping emotions buried beneath duty. But she had also watched Catherine's quiet resilience over the years, had seen how she carried the weight of expectation with grace. And as the conversation at Balmoral grew colder, more focused on image than on people, and made her choice. She decided that silence was no longer loyalty. It was betrayal. After the meeting, pressure mounted on her to stay quiet. She was pulled aside in corridors, spoken to in hushed tones, reminded of responsibilities, reminded of how words spoken publicly cannot be taken back. Those closest to the palace know well that going against the unwritten rule of silence is one of the gravest acts a senior member can commit. But Anne was unmoved. What pushed her wasn't anger. It was something quieter and more powerful. She felt that if she stayed silent, she would be turning her back on someone who mattered deeply to her. The night before her statement, she sat alone in one of the old drawing rooms, a place where portraits of past generations lined the walls. It was said that she reread Catherine's letter that evening. It was a private letter, handwritten in September, with words that carried both strength and sorrow. Catherine had written to, and not just as a member of the family, but as a friend. She wrote about fear, about the weight of not being able to speak for herself, and about the unbearable quiet that surrounded her. One line stood out, etched in Anne's memory: "Silence is not strength. It is only survival." Those words became the heartbeat of what she would do next. By the morning of October 5th, Anne knew there would be no turning back. She stepped out, not as a spokesperson, not as a carefully managed figure, but as a woman who had reached her breaking point. In front of the cameras, her voice trembled not because she was unsure, but because she knew the magnitude of what she was about to do. It was a deliberate crack in the wall of tradition, a moment where decades of learned restraint fell away. And when she spoke of Catherine as brave but unwell, it wasn't only a statement of fact. It was a public declaration that the truth mattered more than the silence. The fallout was swift. Behind closed doors, there was fury. Senior advisors rushed to contain the impact, to reshape what she had said into something manageable. Discussions were held late into the night, and there were whispers of trying to convince and to issue a clarification, a word that often means softening what cannot be undone. But she refused. For the first time in years, someone had broken the script, and there was no going back. Those who know Anne well often describe her as unflinching, direct, and uninterested in political games. That same straightforwardness was exactly what made her act so explosive. She did not couch her words in ambiguity. She did not soften the edges. She spoke the truth as she saw it, and in doing so, she exposed a fracture that had long been growing behind the palace walls. The most striking part of this moment was not just Anne's defiance. It was how clearly it highlighted the weight of the culture she had defied. For generations, the unwritten rule has been clear. Illnesses are to be hidden, private matters are to stay private, and the family presents a single, silent front to the world. To break that rule is to question the very foundation of how things are done. And didn't just question it. She dismantled it in front of millions. Inside the palace, that defiance echoed louder than anyone had anticipated. Some quietly admired her for it, though few would dare to say it out loud. Others viewed it as reckless, something that could not be allowed to happen again. Advisors feared the precedent it set. If one person could break the silence, others might follow. If one person could stand before the world and tell the truth, then the institution itself would no longer control the narrative. And that was a dangerous possibility for those who had spent their lives preserving control. And herself seemed unconcerned with that. Those close to her said she was calm in the days that followed, even as tension mounted. She wasn't trying to spark a rebellion. She wasn't trying to make a statement for the sake of it. She was honoring a promise she felt she had made to someone who could not speak for herself. And in that simple act, she altered the course of the story in a way no carefully crafted statement could have. The public, watching from outside, felt the shift immediately. This wasn't the cold language of a press release. This was emotion, human and unfiltered. It stood in sharp contrast to the carefully managed silence that had defined the previous weeks. People began to see Anne not as just another figure within the palace, but as a person standing against something much larger than herself. And that changed everything. What made this moment even more powerful was how ordinary it seemed. A woman, speaking about another woman she cared for, refusing to hide behind polished words. But in a world where image is everything, such a moment becomes extraordinary. Anne's decision to defy protocol wasn't just about truth. It was about trust. And in breaking the silence, she had unknowingly set a chain of events in motion that the palace could no longer control. The palace had spent decades perfecting the art of silence. It was a silence that felt polished, almost deliberate, like a mask carefully fitted over uncomfortable truths. But in the weeks surrounding Catherine's illness, that silence took on a different shape. It became something heavier. It became strategy. Behind the gleaming windows and historic walls, officials gathered in quiet rooms to decide exactly how much the public would know and how much they would never be allowed to see. It was in those rooms that the phrase "silence is stability" first appeared. It was repeated in meeting notes, emails, and internal memos. It became a mantra, a shield, a line meant to hold back the storm. This was not the first time the palace had withheld information, but this was different. Catherine was not a distant figure. She was a beloved, visible part of public life. Her absence had left a noticeable void, and no amount of rehearsed statements could fill it. When engagements were quietly erased from the calendar, when her name was removed from upcoming appearances, the explanation remained the same. She was resting. She was taking time. Behind those soft words, a network of people worked carefully to keep the real story contained. The decisions were meticulous. Each communication was reviewed, rewritten, and stripped of anything that could hint at the truth. Inside those rooms, the strategy was simple. If they said nothing, if they maintained a calm exterior, public pressure would ease. It always had in the past. A controlled silence could turn a wave of curiosity into quiet acceptance. But what they hadn't counted on was the depth of public attachment to Catherine herself. She was not a distant figurehead. She was a woman people felt they knew, someone who had been a part of their daily lives through every smile, wave, and public moment. Her absence was not something the public was willing to quietly accept. The phrase "silence is stability" was more than just words. It was a reflection of how the institution saw itself. To them, the silence was not a lie. It was protection. It was the preservation of an image they believed had to remain untarnished. But that belief, forged in another time, did not hold the same weight in a world where information moves faster than ever. When Anne spoke, when the memo leaked, that carefully constructed silence began to look less like protection and more like concealment. And once that perception set in, it was almost impossible to control. Within the palace, frustration simmered. Advisors argued behind closed doors about how to handle the situation. Some pushed for more openness, fearing that the longer the silence held, the worse the backlash would be. Others insisted that any admission would only feed public speculation. It was a familiar debate, but this time, the stakes were far higher. Because this time, silence wasn't working. The public was not passive. They noticed each change on the royal schedule. They noticed how Catherine's name slipped quietly from planned events without explanation. They noticed the way questions went unanswered, or worse, were met with carefully chosen words that revealed nothing. The more the palace tried to control the message, the more the absence felt like a presence of its own. People began to fill in the gaps themselves, building theories, demanding answers, holding vigils, sharing memories. What was once a contained situation was now spilling far beyond the palace gates. Emails revealed that officials had created a structured timeline to manage the silence. Key figures were instructed to use the same language if questioned. Specific terms were approved. Any deviation required clearance. In other words, every word spoken to the outside world was scripted. This level of control had worked for generations, but this time, it collided with something more powerful, a grieving, anxious public unwilling to be pacified with empty reassurances. As the walls of silence began to shake, another quiet story unfolded in the background. William was visiting Catherine nightly. His presence at the private clinic was never part of the official record, but whispers began to reach the outside world. Staff described how he arrived late, how he stayed through the night, how exhaustion showed on his face when he left in the early mornings. These were details that no statement could erase. They were human details, the kind that cut through polished narratives and reminded everyone that behind every carefully crafted line, there were people who were hurting. The palace's internal communications reflected growing unease about William's emotional state. He was caught between two worlds. On one side, the strict expectations of an institution that demanded silence. On the other, his love for Catherine, a private reality that could not be hidden behind press releases. Each day that passed made the silence harder to maintain. He was expected to continue with his duties, to appear composed, to say nothing. But he was also expected to be a husband watching the woman he loved endure something painful and private. And statement didn't just break the silence. It exposed how fragile that silence truly was. For the first time, people could see the cracks in the facade. They saw the tension between the family's real emotions and the institution's calculated control. And in that space, something shifted. The silence stopped feeling like stability. It began to feel like avoidance. As this shift deepened, the palace tried to regain control. Carefully worded statements were drafted, each one softer than the last, designed to calm the public without revealing anything new. But the people no longer trusted soft words. They wanted truth. They wanted something real. And every attempt to control the narrative only made the silence feel louder. It became clear that the strategy was collapsing. The same structure that had shielded the family for decades was now making things worse. The longer they refused to speak openly, the more people believed they had something terrible to hide. Silence had once been their strongest defense. Now, it was their greatest liability. What made this moment so powerful wasn't just what was happening to Catherine. It was how the situation peeled away the layers of control the public had long accepted as unshakable. It revealed how decisions were made, how narratives were built, and how easily truth can be hidden behind polished phrases. And it revealed how fragile all of that becomes when even one voice decides to speak out. The silence that had once been their weapon had turned against them. And the world was listening. In the wake of the shattered silence, the heart of the story shifted from palace strategy to something far more human. Beneath the polished speeches and carefully staged appearances, this was always a story about people. At the center of it all was Catherine, quietly fighting her battle in a room that no one outside her closest circle could see. The world now knew fragments of what she was facing, but what made this moment so powerful was not the medical details, which remained private, but the emotional truth surrounding it. This was about love, loyalty, and the quiet strength that lived behind the headlines. For weeks, William spent his nights at her bedside. No public announcement ever mentioned it, but whispers from clinic staff began to fill the gaps that official statements refused to address. He arrived when the halls were quiet, usually well after dark, and slipped in through back entrances known only to those closest to the family. He sat beside her, sometimes reading, sometimes just holding her hand. Staff who saw him spoke later of the look in his eyes, the kind of tired that goes far beyond sleeplessness. It was the look of someone carrying two lives at once, the public and the personal, each pulling in opposite directions. This was a man who had grown up knowing what duty meant. He understood what it meant to wear the public face, to smile on command, to deliver calm words in moments of chaos. But no amount of training prepares someone to watch the person they love endure something so difficult. The weight of royal expectations sat on his shoulders while the weight of private pain pulled at his heart. Those close to the palace described how his schedule began to shift in small, subtle ways. Meetings were moved. Engagements were postponed. Late nights turned into early mornings. And through it all, he said nothing. William's silence was not the same as the palace's silence. The institution had used silence as strategy. For him, it was something else entirely. It was fear. It was exhaustion. It was the heavy burden of wanting to tell the truth, but knowing that every word would have consequences that extended far beyond his family. He had grown up inside that structure. He knew its rules better than anyone. He also knew how unforgiving it could be when those rules were broken. That is why Anne's decision to speak struck so deeply at the heart of the situation. When she stood in front of cameras and broke through the carefully maintained wall, she gave voice to what he could not yet say. Those close to him described a complicated mixture of relief and fear in the aftermath. Relief because someone had finally said out loud what had been eating at him in silence. Fear because he knew the storm that would follow. His love for Catherine was simple. His role was not. Amid the swirl of public reaction, a single piece of paper emerged as the most defining symbol of this story. A letter written by Catherine to Anne, dated September 18th, had quietly existed in the background for weeks before it surfaced. It was not meant for the world. It was a personal plea, written in neat handwriting on simple stationery, free of the formal signatures and seals that usually mark royal correspondence. In it, Catherine wrote from a place of quiet honesty. She spoke about her fears, about her exhaustion, and about the feeling of being trapped beneath layers of silence she had no control over. She did not speak about the details of her illness. Instead, she wrote about the emotional toll of it. She wrote about what it felt like to have her own story decided by others, to watch the world talk about her through carefully filtered statements she hadn't written. One line in particular would become etched into the public consciousness: silence is not strength. It was simple, but devastatingly powerful. Those words revealed everything about how she felt, not just as a public figure, but as a woman who wanted her truth to matter. That letter changed everything. When it was shared with the public, it was not through the palace. It came from someone close to Anne, someone who believed that if Catherine's voice could not be heard directly, then her written words had to speak for her. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Vigils that had begun quietly outside royal residences turned into nationwide gatherings. People brought candles, flowers, and handwritten notes. They read her words aloud to one another. They repeated that one line again and again: silence is not strength. The power of that letter lay in its honesty. For decades, public figures had relied on polished statements crafted by teams of advisors. But this was different. This was personal. It was vulnerable. It was the kind of honesty that can't be rehearsed. People saw not a distant figure, but a human being, someone who was tired of being spoken for. It didn't matter that she hadn't given a speech or appeared on camera. That single letter carried more weight than any press conference could. William's struggle grew heavier as the letter spread. The world had now heard her words. They knew how she felt about the silence. They understood that this was not just a private battle, but a fight against being muted. William was faced with a choice that few could truly imagine. On one side, the expectations of the institution, built on generations of silence. On the other, the raw, human truth of his wife's voice, written in her own hand. It was not a simple choice, and it left him walking a narrow line between personal loyalty and inherited duty. As the days turned into nights, that line grew thinner. Advisors grew more nervous. Public appearances became shorter and more tightly controlled. Behind the scenes, William prepared a national address. It wasn't clear how much he intended to reveal, but the fact that he was willing to consider speaking at all signaled something monumental. This was not a man who rushed into public declarations. This was someone who had watched the silence collapse around him and was beginning to understand that the truth might be the only way forward. And still, through all of this, Catherine remained out of sight. Her absence, once quiet and uncertain, had now become something that filled every room. It was in the letters placed at palace gates. It was in the chants of people holding candles in the night. It was in the whispers within the palace itself. Her silence no longer belonged to the institution. It belonged to her. And it was that quiet power that would ultimately push this story to a place from which there would be no return. The letter had done what months of carefully managed silence could not. It had made people feel something real. And once the public feels something real, no amount of strategy can take that away. The palace had tried to hold the narrative in its hands. Catherine, with a single letter, had placed it back into the hands of the people. And the world was no longer willing to accept anything less than the truth. The final moments of this unfolding story have brought the royal world to a place few could have imagined. For decades, silence was the bedrock of palace life. It was the unspoken language of a family whose public image was carefully maintained behind walls of gold and protocol. But that silence has now been broken, not by scandalous tabloids or distant critics, but by one of its own. What began with a single emotional statement has cascaded into a storm that now defines the future of the monarchy itself. This is not just a private health battle anymore. It has become a mirror reflecting the tension between public devotion and institutional secrecy. And in this moment, history is being written in real time, not in the polished lines of official statements but in the raw, trembling voice of a woman who dared to speak. When Princess Anne stood before cameras and spoke with tears in her eyes, something in the country shifted. People who once felt distant from palace affairs felt an unexpected closeness to the story. The vulnerability, the pain, the honesty, all of it collided with the public's own frustration with years of controlled messaging. For so long, palace statements were polished, scripted, and sparse. They were crafted to protect the image, not reveal the reality. But Anne's words tore through that shield. She didn't speak like a representative of an ancient institution. She spoke like a sister, like a human being whose heart could no longer bear the weight of silence. That authenticity is what made the world stop and listen. It was not the grand halls, or the titles, or the carefully crafted protocols that captured people's hearts. It was the sound of truth breaking through. Behind closed doors, the impact of that truth rippled like a shockwave. Every carefully laid strategy built to control the narrative crumbled. The old rules about what can and cannot be said no longer held. People who had worked their entire lives to preserve the polished exterior of royal life found themselves in uncharted territory. Meetings stretched long into the night as senior figures tried to find a way to regain control. But the world outside those gates had already changed. Vigils grew larger. Protest signs filled streets. Social media burned with questions and emotion. It was not just about Catherine's health anymore. It was about the public's right to know. It was about trust. And trust, once cracked, is rarely repaired by silence. What truly deepened the emotional weight of this moment was Catherine's own voice. Her letter, quiet and handwritten, carried a simple truth that could not be ignored. In that letter, she didn't speak like a figurehead. She spoke like a woman facing a storm she never asked for. Her words, "Silence is not strength," reached into living rooms and hearts across the country. People wept reading them. They saw in her letter a reflection of their own struggles, their own moments of feeling powerless in the face of something bigger. Catherine's choice to trust Anne with her words was not just a private act of love. It became a public turning point, a message carried far beyond the palace gates. The reaction that followed proved something that those inside the palace had long underestimated. People do not simply want to be told stories about strength. They want to see it. They want to feel it in the quiet, human moments that remind them their icons are real people. Catherine's letter became a symbol of that. It transformed the narrative from one about secrecy and distance to one about courage and shared humanity. Her pain became a thread that tied millions together. And that thread, once pulled, unraveled the tightly wrapped image of the royal family in ways no planned statement ever could. Inside the palace, the weight of this truth began to reshape everything. Schedules halted. Engagements paused. Behind every closed curtain, the faces of those once so confident now carried uncertainty. The tradition of silence that had protected the family for generations now felt like a wall closing in. The people on the outside were no longer content with carefully chosen words. They wanted sincerity. They wanted openness. And for perhaps the first time in modern memory, the palace had no playbook for this kind of honesty. This was not a situation that could be smoothed over with soft speeches or carefully worded press releases. This was a reckoning. For William, this reckoning was personal. Every passing day without answers became a weight on his shoulders. He spent sleepless nights at Catherine's side, torn between two worlds that seemed impossible to reconcile. One was the world of duty, tradition, and silence. The other was the world of love, pain, and truth. That private struggle, though never fully shown to the public, could be felt. It hung in the air like a quiet, shared grief. People saw in his silence not indifference but heartbreak. And as the pressure grew, it became clear that the truth would have to come out, not through distant press officers but through those who lived it. Princess Anne's act of defiance became more than a moment. It became a symbol. By standing against the expectation of silence, she gave a voice to what many felt but could not say. Her decision to honor Catherine's wishes was seen not as a betrayal of the family, but as a gesture of love and loyalty to something deeper than tradition. It reminded the world that at the core of these towering institutions are human beings who feel fear, love, and pain like everyone else. Her words carved a line in the sand, a moment where the old rules could no longer simply return once the storm passed. And so, as the world watches this story continue to unfold, it becomes clear that a new chapter has already begun. No matter what happens in the coming weeks, the illusion of perfect control has been shattered. People now know that silence is a choice, not a necessity. They have seen what happens when that silence is broken by someone with enough courage to speak. Princess Anne's voice has become a turning point, not just for the family behind the palace walls, but for everyone who has ever wondered what truth sounds like when spoken in the face of immense pressure. This story may be rooted in royal life, but its echoes stretch far beyond it. It speaks to the universal truth that silence, while safe, is not always right. It speaks to the power of love, of loyalty, of choosing to speak even when the cost is great. It speaks to a family that for the first time in a long time has been forced to confront the reality of their own humanity in the most public way possible. And it speaks to a world that is no longer content to accept carefully written lines when they know there are real stories beating beneath them. As the lights dim in the palace halls and the world waits for the next move, one thing remains certain. This was the moment silence broke. This was the moment truth found its way out, not through official channels but through the trembling, honest voice of a woman who loved enough to speak. And once truth has been spoken like that, there is no going back to the way things were. It lingers, it grows, it shapes the path ahead. And in that path, the world now waits, holding its breath, ready to see what comes next.